So I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Jasmine Antoine, who is a neonatologist at Martha Mothers. She's a mum of twins and an older girl who is 8, did you say?
Yeah.
And the twins had some time in the neonatal unit, so she's got experience from both sides of the spectrum. And she's a frequent Don't Forget the Bubbles contributor, some amazing articles on there that she's written all about neonates. She's really passionate about medical education and is currently doing a PhD looking at patient safety and human factors. And she's going to talk to us about safety in difficult procedures. Thank you, Jasmine.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Hello, everyone. It's always great to be the first speaker. So today I'm going to be talking about safety in difficult procedures. And as a neonatologist, we do a lot of procedures. Some of those are complex and some of those are difficult. And as clinicians, we know that procedures don't always go to plan. Sometimes they're unsuccessful, sometimes they lead to patient harm, and whether that's temporary or permanent harm, and sometimes procedures lead to our patients dying. In the US, there was a study done in 2019 and it looked at about 10 neonatal intensive care units, and it showed that in 50% of the cases of neonatal intubation, there was an adverse event. So an episode of bradycardia, desaturations, or a misplaced tube. And the year before, a wider study in the UK that looked at over 140 neonatal intensive care units showed in that the previous 5 years, there'd been a serious adverse event or death related to an intubation. So when we think about those numbers, they're quite high, aren't they? And is it because as neonatologists and senior neonatal clinicians, we don't know what we're doing? Is it because we need more training? Or is it the fact that neonatal procedures and other procedures are really complex and difficult? So when we're thinking about intubation, we know that it's a multi-step, multi-team player procedure, isn't it? It often occurs in a critical situation. And for neonates, some of our patients will be less than 400 grams, which adds to that difficulty. And in our environment, as probably many of your environments is experiencing, we're having difficulty teaching our trainees. We're having difficulty exposing them to enough experience that they can get the expertise that they need to perform the procedure. So, how do we move forward from there? Well, we know that with intubation and other procedures, it's not just the technical skill of doing the intubation. When we're the lead clinician, we're also having to work with our team, lead our team, problem solve as we're doing the procedure, and that all adds to the complexity. So the things that we're going to talk about today about how we can achieve safety in difficult procedures, some of it will be dependent on us, some of it will be dependent on our skill level, setting limitations, but there's also a significant impact about who makes up our team and also the environment and the system that we're in. So we know that improving patient safety is not completely reliant on getting more policies and procedures. It's not reliant on having a culture of blaming and shaming. We know that improving patient safety is not achieved by having error-free performance. It's not just reliant on us as the clinician. There's the idea of safety 1 versus safety 2, which you may be aware of, and it looks at, in procedures that go well and have good outcomes, errors still occur. And in procedures that go poorly or are difficult and challenging, that have poor outcomes, good things still occur. So we're kind of moving from a culture, and hopefully in your workplace too, where we're focusing more on not only errors, but also the excellence that occurs in adverse events and how we can learn from them. And as we move from that culture, focusing more on, sorry, I pressed something. As we move from the culture of blaming and the culture where we're just focused, we're also focusing on the fact that errors will continue to occur, and when they do occur, how we can support our team members. Okay. So what makes a procedure difficult for you? And it'll be different for everybody in the room. You know, are you in emergency training and you're setting up for a procedure and you've got to think about what else is going to come through the door while you're doing that procedure? Are you a junior doctor and you're doing the procedure for the first time and you're just trying to think through the steps? Think through, you know, which order do I have to do this in? This is really overwhelming. Are you a physician trainee? You've just rotated to a new environment. You've got to do a procedure in a timely manner. You're not sure where the equipment is. You can't find anyone to assist you, and the procedure room is currently busy. You know, I talk about all these things because as we move through our training, the reasons why a procedure is difficult will change. And as a neonatologist, I'm often on call and I often receive a lot of phone calls, and sometimes I have to go in to actually do a procedure. And recently I had to go in at about 2 o'clock in the morning to put a peripheral inserted central catheter in for a baby that was critically unwell, and that baby needed some inotropes. And as you can imagine, at 2 a.m, after being woken multiple times prior to that, my phone motor skills, quite like now, were not at their best. And so that was a difficult procedure for me. So as we move through, you know, training and as we move through different positions, the reason why something is difficult will change. It might initially be because of our lack of expertise. It might be because of our environment. So what we're going to do is talk about how we can keep procedures safe, what we can actually contribute. So one of the things is setting yourself up for success. So are you the right person to do that procedure? Is now the right time? Have you got all the equipment that you need? Do you need any supervision? And have you asked them to come and assist you? When we teach people how to do complex procedures, we often teach them how to do it in the same order, am I right? You know, we have checklists, and that's the reasons why we have protocols around procedures. And when I'm setting up for umbilical lines, I like to take the time at the beginning to set things out in the order. And there's 3 reasons I like to do that. The first one is that it gives me that couple of minutes before a procedure starts to think through the steps, because it could have been a couple of months since I've done that procedure. It also helps me offload some of that workload when I'm doing the challenging procedure, because I know the instrument that I need next will be to my right. And it helps me in a third way, that when the procedure is not going as planned, when I think about what instrument I need, I know exactly where it is on the tray. So being prepared can really help us when we're doing a procedure that's complex, and it can help us in circumstances when that procedure becomes more difficult. But it's also important to be flexible. So we know that it's not always practical to do a procedure in exactly the same way every time. Okay? We don't want to be that clinician that can only put a cannula in with one brand of cannulas, or can only intubate with a certain size handle, straight versus curved blade. I'm sure people have opinions about that. We know that psychological flexibility, which is your ability to kind of respond to your stressful environment, if you have a high psychological flexibility, then you have a higher ability to respond to a stressful environment. Okay? So your non-technical and technical skills during those stressful periods is better. Your ability to learn in those stressful resuscitations or when you're doing that complex procedure is better. I've also got on the slide, as you can see, about becoming well practiced in your environment, and I think this is really important. So it's not only learning how to do the skill, but it's also getting used to the team. It's also getting used to, you know, what lighting is available, watching other people that do the procedure well in your environment so you can get tips and tricks off them. And there will be some things that don't work practically. You know, it says in the protocol that we should do this next, but no one's doing that. So why isn't anyone following those steps in the policy or protocol? You know, these can be areas that we can target to improve the quality of our procedures. So I'd encourage you also to be involved in that quality improvement process, which I know can be long and arduous sometimes, but it's important to have people that are actually doing the process on a day-to-day basis. Setting limitations is also very important. So when you're doing a procedure, when you're the clinical lead, how do you reflect back? What are the stop points when you're going for your 3rd attempt at a cannula that make you reflect, am I the right person right now for this patient to do the procedure? It's very easy to become task focused, isn't it? So it's important to kind of have those points, those red flags, that every time that you're doing a particular procedure you have. Okay. When I was a junior trainee, I was working regionally and was on night shift, as all good things happen on night shift, as we know. A 23-weeker was born, and I was having my second attempt at trying to intubate them. And my consultant, who hadn't intubated an neonate for many years, had already also had an attempt. And we made a decision together that we were going to ventilate the baby just via mask, intermittent positive pressure ventilation. Even though we knew the retrieval was a couple of hours away, we made that decision because that was the best decision for the baby at the time. And what I didn't know then, which I now know, is that when you have very preterm babies under 1,500 grams, every additional attempt at intubation increases your risk of severe intraventricular hemorrhage. It increases your risk of long-term neurodevelopmental impairment, and it also increases your risk of death. So it's important for you not to only set limitations for yourself, but also think, how is this procedure that I'm continuing to do, how is that going to impact on my patient, and set limitations for your patient. So complex procedures are often a team sport. You know, they don't just involve us as the primary clinician. How do you escalate things when you're worried or concerned? When you see someone perhaps becoming task focused? What language do you use? Who do you direct it at? What's your body language like? I think it's important for us each to reflect, as we all have our own personalities, our own strengths and weaknesses, about what were the occasions where we stood up and said something for the patient, or we advocated for the clinician that perhaps they weren't doing the best that they could be in that moment. And what were the circumstances where we didn't say anything, even though we could see an adverse event about to happen or an error about to happen, and why was that? And I think that's important because it can kind of highlight to us, when we're faced in those circumstances the next time, how we can make a change. When you're the lead clinician doing a procedure, how do you offer others the opportunity to escalate their concerns? Before doing a procedure, do you talk through the process? Do you let the team know, if I'm unsuccessful in my first go, this is what I'm going to do otherwise? During the procedure, do you openly state, this isn't going so well, guys, is it? You know, have you got any advice for me? Because people will have different viewpoints. If they're sitting there, you know, even if they've never done the procedure before, perhaps if they're your assistant, they can help you. Do you go get someone to go that might be able to help supervise you? And what about after the procedure? Do you ask for feedback? Do you debrief? And I think debriefing, I'm sure you're going to hear a lot about debriefing in the next couple of days, but debriefing is really important. The literature that debriefing helps improve team dynamics. It helps leadership, enhancing peer support and our own resilience, and it also helps patient outcomes. It's important that debriefing is done right, though. It's not good enough that we just debrief. We need to have people that are trained as facilitators to help us debrief. And it shouldn't just be because you're the most senior clinician that you're going to be good at debriefing, or you're the director, so you're good at debriefing. Okay? We need to train how to debrief and practice how to debrief as well. And it's also important before we debrief to think, what is the purpose of this debrief? Are we debriefing to unpack the trauma that's just happened from the unsuccessful resuscitation? Or are we debriefing because we want to, think about what we did, the processes that we did as a team, and how we can collectively learn from this? There are many barriers to debriefing at the end of an unsuccessful, say, resuscitation or an unsuccessful procedure. And someone very clever said to me this week that debriefing is part of the emergency. And I really like that way of thinking. It's that full circle. We should take the opportunity, even when there's a full room, like waiting room of patients to see, or an unwell baby to see next, we should take that opportunity to reflect, and it is important for us as well. So let's talk very quickly, because I can see that's read already, about how does our environment and system, how does our environment and our system impact on procedures? The environment can definitely make things more difficult. Are there the stools available so you can do a lumbar puncture sitting down? Is the light over this isolate not working? Is this brand of isolate make it really difficult to access the baby? So before doing a procedure, we need to move the baby. All those things add to the complexity of a procedure, don't they? And what about the system? Are we, do we have to order an X-ray on one type of login, one type of program, then we can't see it at the bedside, so we need to shuffle over to see it on the computer, which we then have to log into, and then the radiologist reports it on a third type of system, and we've had to log into each of those, and 15 minutes later, all you can still see is the imaging and the report somewhere else. All those things impact on our ability to do a procedure and make things more complicated. So we've talked a little bit about the things that we can do to make a procedure safer, and then also the impact of things around us like our team, our environment, the system. But what we acknowledged at the beginning of the talk was that critical errors and adverse events will still occur no matter our personal contribution, no matter how great we are as a clinician, they will still occur. And a clinician named Albert Wu, who you may have heard about 20 years ago, coined the phrase the second victim. He said that many errors are built into existing routines and devices, setting up the unwitting physician and the patient for disaster. So after an error occurs, it not just impacts the patient and their family, they're the first victim, but it also impacts us, the clinicians, the second victim, and then has some flow-on effect also to the healthcare system. So I think it's really important for us that when we are part of an adverse event, or part of an error, that we're kind to ourselves, and we're also mindful of our, self-critical rumination that I'm sure lots of us, being the type of people that we are that leads us to healthcare, will do. It's very important that we're mindful of it because 60% of us, after a critical error or event, will need assistance, will need support from our peers, and 10% of us will need some professional assistance. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we shouldn't feel shameful about that that is a normal thing, and that it is not our fault and our fault alone that errors occur, and that it's, if you haven't been involved in a critical error, it's only a matter of time. And for those that have been involved in a critical adverse event, it probably is going to happen again before we finish up in the clinical world. So, today we've talked about improving patient safety, that it's not just reliant on your skills as the proceduralist. It can be impacted upon by, it's important to think about our skills and our limitations, but it definitely is impacted upon by our team, the system, and the environment in which we work in. And that no matter how wonderful a proceduralist you are, errors will still occur, and that when they do occur, we need to seek support. We need to seek assistance, and there's no shame in doing that. Thanks. Becky.
Thank you, Jasmine.
Yep.
Thank you, Jasmine. That was
Thank
amazing
you.
talk.
Thank you.
Just while you're gathering your thoughts, we've got Henry at the back who's got a roving mic around, so if you just stick your hand up, or got a couple of questions. I just wanted to reflect on one of comments on Twitter, Jordan Walters saying beautifully about the second victim, and I would echo that, when we've all been involved, so it's important that we're kind to ourselves. Did someone manage to get hold of Mike? Oh,
hello.
Thanks, Lauren.
Hi. Just wanting to ask a question about how we balance the most appropriate person to do a procedure versus the need for training and need for our trainees to access the opportunities. As a relatively new consultant, I find it a little bit challenging to be able to balance knowing that in the room I'm probably the best person or the most recent or the most practiced person to do a particular procedure, but I need to give opportunities to my trainees. And how do we facilitate that and scaffold it in a way that is safe and allowing for the best outcomes for the patient, but also the needs of our trainees, because they need access to these sort of opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really challenging, isn't it? And that's something we're facing a lot in neonates as well, because there's just not as many procedures as there once was. But it's important for people, to develop their experience in order to get their expertise. I think one of the ways that we manage it in our workplace, and I work with Professor Liley here, one of the ways that we is that we have a pretty frank discussion amongst the consultant group about what type of patient is for the novice. And I think that's really important to establish. And what type of patient, is for us and or a very experienced fellow. And so for us, it's kind of, and many of you, if anybody else is in neonates as well, we always say the extremely premature baby, so under 28 weeks, the extremely low birth rate baby under 1 kilo are not for novice practitioners. And it's kind of a hard line in the sand. And then I think it really depends on what your unit outcomes are like. So areas that you're trying to work on, you're trying to work on, for us, like the golden hour of working more hands off. And I think that really drives which operators should be doing the procedure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hey.
We'll take the one from the floor and then we'll take one from Twitter.
Great. Thanks, Jasmine, for that wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Can I ask about the debrief process specifically? I know some centres will do kind of an emotional debrief straight after, looking at that kind of trying to mitigate some of those second victim kind of effects, and then later on we'll then do the more technical debrief. How do you kind of guide that if you are giving a debrief?
Good question. I would say that in neonates we are nowhere near as good as we should be in debriefing. That's really definitely my experience. And we're kind of pushing to do debriefing more often, but it's, we face a lot of the barriers. We don't have a lot of trained facilitators in debriefing. There's probably only a couple in my workplace at the moment. And so that can be really challenging then to facilitate a good debriefing. For me personally, I think there is a lot of value in kind of doing that initial well-being debrief, but it's also often really challenging because you're often the one that was leading the clinic, the lead clinician or the lead proceduralist, and then you've kind of, while you're still feeling all that turmoil as well about the unsuccessful resuscitation, you're the one that then kind of has to, encompass everybody else and embrace them and help them through unpacking that trauma, and it can be really challenging. So obviously if there's someone else available, it's always good to kind of hand that off if you can for that initial debrief. I think it's important if we can get as many people trained in debriefing as possible. We know, like the literature shows us that people that are expected to debrief, like emergency fellows and things, don't often get training. And we also know that you need to be a good debriefer to have the successful outcome. So I think that's important, trying to get through as many people as you can through the training.
Yeah, thanks. I think from my experience, it's just making it part of the norm. So I really reflect on what you were saying. It's just the debrief becomes part of the procedure.
Yeah, absolutely.
If it's just a normal that you're going to evaluate your practice, then it's...
Yeah, I think it's
really
important
powerful.
to have champions in your unit as well, to be talking about that all the time, that is part of the norm. We just debrief at the end. It doesn't matter how busy we are. This is important for us. It's important for future patients. It's probably important for this patient too. Yeah.
We've probably got time for one more question from the floor, if anyone else has got a comment. I'm going to jump in with one question.
Yes, please do.
That's the chair's prerogative.
That's your right.
And my love is about simulation training.
Me too.
And so, so with your experience as a simulation coordinator as well, where do you think simulation fits in terms of training for difficult procedures?
Oh, good. Well, I'm currently doing my PhD on that, so maybe I'll let you know in 4 or 5 years. But I think it's really important, and like we were saying up the back before, our trainees aren't getting exposed enough to procedures. So simulation, I think, fits right in there. It's not as good as real life experience, absolutely, but it also doesn't harm patients, and it also gives us the availability to patients, but using mannequins. So I think that's probably where it fits, and I think that's a mixture of high fidelity simulations and also kind of, task part trainers, definitely.
Great. One more question from the floor and then we'll move on.
Thanks so much, Jasmine. I'm a general paediatrician. I work in a level 2 unit in New Zealand, and I would be required to intubate a neonate twice a year maybe, do a long line twice a year. And I think that you've alluded to the relative infrequency with which we do neonatal procedures these days. And I just wonder, for those of us working in non-tertiary centres, if you have any suggestions as far as models that work well for the infrequent but high stress procedures that
we're required to do and
Yeah.
when we have to keep up to date from a skills perspective?
It's really hard, isn't it? Even when you've kind of, you know, supposedly developed enough experience to be the expert, I feel even for us, and I don't know if Helen feels this way too, but even for us, you know, in a big tertiary centre, it can be months between me doing a procedure and then I'm called in as the, you know, 7th, 8th person to put a pick in. I'm like, well, let's give this a go. So I think that I know kind of simulation kind of exposes you, doesn't it? And as the most expert, you kind of feel a bit uncomfortable that you should have it all down pat and that you shouldn't need to practice. But I think definitely simulation can help, and whether that's just a mannequin and you and the equipment and you're going through the process versus a high fidelity simulation in front of everybody, I think there is value in doing that even when you're the team leader or even when you're the expert, absolutely. But you know, it can be challenging, and I think sometimes when you work small places and even when you sometimes work bigger places, there are some clinicians that won't do certain type of procedures because they feel that they don't have enough, they're not doing it frequently enough to maintain their skills. And I think being aware of that is also important. You know, setting that limitation for yourself is also important. And perhaps there's a group of people that do all the long lines, and perhaps, you know, but it's not always practical, is it? It's not like you can call them in the middle of the night when they're not on call and say, can you come and put this in for me? Like, you know, you don't want to be that person, do you? So it's really challenging. And we have some colleagues that, you know, go to NICUs to upskill every year. So there's lots of different options, is there? But I do agree that it is challenging, and I have no perfect answer for you, I'm sorry.
Well, thank you. Let's give Jasmine a big round of applause.